What is up, guys, and welcome back to Koi's Corner. Now, we all have a body. We reside within our body for the most part. It's what we use. It's the vessel we inhabit to live out our lives in this physical human form. And whether it's from consciousness to our mind, to our thoughts, to our soul, this all resides within the body, within our brain. But what if it doesn't fully reside within the body? What if, in fact, the body and the mind are two completely separate things that are not one, that are simply using each other effectively and efficiently? In essence, what if we are simply our minds inside of our brain controlling our body? Is this sort of thing even possible, remotely possible? And if so, what would it be known as? Let's find out. Now, this theory, this idea, this philosophy of our mind and body being two separate things is what's known as dualism, or more specifically in this notion known as mind-body dualism. And it has to do with this philosophy of the mind and body being separate, essentially the material world and the mental world, the conscious world. And what it basically states is that we are not simply matter, we are not simply physical existences on this planet as part of this universe, but something more than that, something conscious, something aware, something understanding on a level within the brain that doesn't really make sense in this physical world, that doesn't exist within this physical world. And from this, it deduces that the mind is not part of the brain or the body, but simply instead exists within the brain, that the mind is its own separate thing. It's not an inherent part of what we feel and see and dissect and understand about the biology of human bodies, of any sentient body for that matter. And this means that the mind is non-physical, while the body is, of course, physical. They are not inherently the same thing, but they instead use each other to exist and coexist perfectly for what we experience. So again, on a universal scale, there is matter, there is the physical, the material, things that exist and are tangible, and then there is the mind, there is consciousness, which is not physical, which cannot be weighed or contained in any way. So before we can understand dualism fully in the sense of mind and body being separate, what is the mind? How do we even define the mind? That question in itself is very hard to answer, because the mind is not just simply the matter that exists within our brain that we can hold and analyze and deduce this is the mind. That's the brain, not the mind, which makes it a very complicated question. And the mind at this level handles much more than just consciousness. It encompasses the entire intake of information as we know it, all of our sensory information, and is somehow changed and created within our mind to create a picture of the universe as we see it, as we understand it. And this process of taking all this binary information and turning it into an experience with emotions attached to it, with recall attached to it, with all these different perceptions we can have on it, are what make the mind so interesting. Essentially, the mind is what creates the very fabric of reality as we perceive it, as we see it. And as the very famous physicist Richard Feynman once stated, if you don't know how something works, you must create it to fully understand it. And seeing as we lack the ability to fully replicate a brain, let alone the mind within a brain, it just shows how complex the mind really is. So on this level, it becomes impossible to just write the mind off as part of the brain. It just wouldn't work like that. See, the argument with dualism starts with physical things, with things we can touch, see, feel, etc. And this is because physical things do not last forever. They are temporary. Even on a universal scale, universes themselves pop in and out of existence over the course of billions of years. Nothing stays as it is in a physical state forever. And this fact that the physical world as we know it, including our bodies, including this planet, being temporary things, are where the argument for the mind existing on its own come into play. Because the mind can't be measured in the sense of how long it will last, whether it is temporary or not. And from this, we can deduce that because of this, because of the fact that we cannot measure the mind on this scale, that it is not inherently true or factual or provable that the mind simply ceases to exist once our bodies cease to exist. Is it possible? Of course, but is it proven? Not at all. After all, the mind is a receiver. It receives information and translates it back out to what we see, what we experience. So for all intents and purposes, a mind could simply be the antenna within a radio. You don't see radio waves passing in front of your face at all times, but they do. The radio antenna simply picks it up and translates it into sound. And we can kind of take this idea of how radios work, stuff like that, and attribute it to the mind, that the mind simply might be taking information that always has existed and always will, and putting it back out into the world as we transmit it. Because dualism doesn't automatically assume that is what occurs. It is simply the statement that mind and body are separate, not what mind and body do separately. That really isn't the focus of dualism itself. And Rene Descartes is mainly the man who brought dualism into the common light of understanding its possibility in the 17th century. And he did this by making an argument for the soul, or now as we know it as the mind, to be eternal, to be immortal. But his form of this argument was different. He talked about God and the devil, good and evil, more subjective things that are other kind of emotional experiences or religious experiences, but we're on a scientific basis with this, just seeing it as mind and body. Now just imagine your physical body as the letter X, and then imagine your mind as the letter Y. Now you feel your body, I feel my body, you control your body, I control my movements, but that does not mean you are your body. And this is what brings in the essence of falsifiability, what you can and cannot disprove or prove. Essentially what has the possibility or potential to exist versus what has no potential to exist. And this is where non-falsifiability comes in, is that there are certain things you can't prove don't exist. So if someone claims you are your body on a physical level, it is true. But it is also possible that you could exist without your body, with simply having your mind. Therefore, this being a non-falsifiable thing, it makes it possible that you could exist simply with your mind and not in need of your body. Essentially, it is on some levels possible to exist without a body and simply a mind. So in a scientific way of speaking, if you are X or your body, then it is impossible that you are not your body, that you are not X. But the second unfalsifiable problem is that you aren't your body, that you could possibly be Y, your mind. And this leads us to X equals Y. If you are your body, then you are also your mind in this body. So how do we talk about this in layman's terms, without these numbers, without these math equations? Essentially, it is that if you are your body, then you are also your mind. But since there is a possibility of existing without your body, minus the body, you become your mind scientifically. Basically, you are your mind and body, but since there is a possibility that you can exist without that body, Y becomes the only option. The answer to this equation is Y. And therefore, this leads us to the scientific statement that you are not your body. So if you can't be your body on this scientific level, you have only one other option, and that means that you and me are simply our mind, and you can only be your mind on this level, which means that dualism is a philosophy that makes sense not only philosophically but scientifically, and shows us through these postulates that we are minds within our body. We are not simply our body and mind as one, but instead something that resides within our body, within our brain. Our mind is its own creation, but how that is, why that is, how it came to be, we don't have answers for yet. We just know this is a possibility, and a very well viewed one, not only scientifically but spiritually as well, because it gives rise to the soul, arguments for the soul, for afterlife, for new dimensions, etc. It raises these questions and makes them not only possible but scientifically valid on this level. And that essentially, even though it is a little bit complicated, is what we know as dualism today. The beautiful 17th century idea that our mind exists within our body, that we are not simply our body, but more than it. So hopefully that helps you guys understand just kind of more about mind-body dualism, the philosophy behind it. I'll have more links in the description below. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment if you have any questions. I know it's a complicated topic. I'll try to answer some of them. And as always, I will see you guys next week.